I just want to thank you for coming in today. My guest, Eric Wheeler of Positively Portland Walking Tours. Um, and For those of you who haven't heard any of our podcasts before, this is Shalise Austin. I'm the owner and managing broker of Larkin Fir Realty, and we are located in the Raleigh Hills neighborhood of Southwest Portland. For those of the people tuning in today who haven't heard of you or your business, can you tell us a little bit about the services that you offer as part of Positively Portland and the coverage areas that you serve?
Sure. I am an educator by background and inclination. So I started my career as an architectural historian almost 30 years ago. I was a real estate appraiser for some 30 years.
I remember that.
And there was that overlap period. But
Yeah.
I found that of all the work that I was doing as an architectural historian, that after all the reports and the research and writing National Register nominations and so forth, it was the walking tours that really kind of resonated for me. And you're with people and you can see, the awareness, the aha, the questions, the delight. And so walking tours really has been my main vehicle, so to say, since I moved to Portland about 14 years ago. And so my main product, if you will, were neighborhood walking tours all over the city of Portland, all 6 quadrants, little villages on the periphery, neighborhoods on the periphery. So what I'm doing recently, I'm still doing walking tours, but I've been, thanks to people like you, I've been connected to the real estate community. And so I'm continually doing tours for title insurance companies, for individual realtors. I have just in the near term here, I'm helping out at a couple of open houses.
Okay.
So I'm kind of co-hosting.
Oh, interesting.
So as people come between 1 and 3 or between 11 and 2 or whatever the time is, I'm standing in, typically it would be in like the living room or the dining room where there's some architectural elements. And so people will come in and the host realtor will say, Mr. Wheeler is here, he's an architectural historian, if you'd like to talk about the history of the building, the neighborhood, and he'll be offering a walking tour at about, 1:30 or 2:30 and so forth. And part of it is kind of the delight of architecture.
Oh,
the
absolutely.
delight of design,
Yeah.
interior, exterior, and how Portland, that's one of the things that I really enjoy about Portland, is the sort of playful, whimsical inventiveness of builders and architects that desire to create something that's original but is also well suited to the climate, to the topography.
Absolutely. We talk about,
use.
Pacific Northwest,
Yes.
mid-century architecture, a little bit different than what you would find in the greater Chicago area or certainly California. And
So it makes it fun.
So interesting. Yeah. So I would love to know how you started. I know you're not from Portland. You touched on it briefly, but why here? Why?
Yeah, really good question. So at a point in my life, I was turning 60 and free to really relocate. My family was raised and I was self-employed at that point, which I still am. And so I thought, well, I'm going to take a look at the Pacific Northwest. And I came out here with a friend. I spent a week just kind of walking around Portland, and I resolved within a very short period of time, this was 2009, I said, I'm moving to Portland. And I did, because I felt at the time, and still feel, that this is a place where I can do the work that I love.
Yeah.
And so I started with no connections. I had no family, no friends, no work, no other connections, and I kind of built this business, this Positively Portland Walking Tours. So I've kind of tweaked that a bit. I'm not doing as many just straight ahead walking tours, but I'm doing these more custom projects for realtors. So I would say, long answer to a short question, why here? Because Portland, obviously, Pacific Northwest has a more, shall we say, salubrious climate than the upper Midwest, okay?
Yes.
It's not only healthful, but it's also a lot more tolerable.
Yes,
so,
I agree.
And clearly the communities, the culture, the architecture that reflects a lot of that kind of whimsy, playfulness, and inventiveness. I've used that term a lot. That is in the Portland area. So that continues to fascinate me. It continues also to delight me.
Yeah.
So anyway, I guess that's again a long answer to a short question.
No,
It's
that's
just,
okay.
It just continually fascinates me.
It's interesting too, because my family in Massachusetts, their impression of Portland is that, they think of it as being like Alaska.
Huh.
California, they all think it's just like it rains every day.
Yeah.
And in New England, they think that I've moved to like,
Way up north.
an igloo. Like, oh, how's the snow? And I'm like, no, there's no snow
There's no
unless
snow.
you go up to the mountains. You
Right.
don't have it.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's interesting that we have that. We were both drawn here by by its uniqueness and its approachability. But getting back to how you work, I wonder how you prepare in when doing a tour. If somebody wants to hire you to do a tour in a specific neighborhood, and you think, geez, I've actually never been there, or I've not done a tour there. And having been in a few of your tours over the years, I know that you like to have the history on some of the notable buildings or some of the notorious episodes that might include that area.
Sure.
So I'd love to know how you prepare.
Well, actually, it's a fairly simple methodology that I have practiced now for these 12 years or so in Portland. I choose a starting place where there will be restrooms for my patrons. Right? So oftentimes it's a coffee shop, or it's a brew pub, or it's a restaurant, something easy to find where there's parking available, and some building that is close by that would be a logical place to start.
Okay.
So I find the starting place, and then I just kind of walk around and come up with, I say, I don't want this to be more than a mile. Typically they're actually less than a mile. And I'm going to have stops at no more than 12 buildings, sometimes less, rarely any more than that. And so I just kind of map it out. And I start walking to what I think would be the logical next building, and then from here to the next building. So it's a matter of actually getting out, feet on the ground, looking at the buildings, thinking about where the sun might be shining or where there might be shelter if it's raining. I mean, obviously you can't anticipate all those things, but I try to look for something that is manageable.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's manageable, gives people a good feel of the variety of architecture in that particular neighborhood, and is, I think, a logistics. I don't want it to be too far. I don't want it to be too, in some areas there's more exposure to sun if we're doing it in June or July.
Right.
So I try to think of all these different levels of the experience of the person on the tour.
Right.
A, what they're going to find interesting. B, what buildings I can use to say, that is a great example of a 1920s colonial revival, and it's got shutters and it's got clapboard siding, et cetera, bilateral symmetry. So I also try to bring in architectural terminology about details and styles that people then can incorporate into their understanding of architecture. So I assume that most people who are coming on my walking tours, A, have an interest, right? Yeah. And are looking to learn.
Yes.
Right? So that's, again, kind of, I have a methodology in a neighborhood that I've been curious about, but I've never developed a tour. I sort of start where this would be a good starting place. It's easy to find this address.
And do you look at the provenance of the homes, the lineage?
Good question. I don't do, with a few exceptions, I don't usually do a dig on the ownership, the chain of ownership, unless it's something. Obviously, if the building's on the National Register, that information is right there.
Yes.
So what I typically will do, it is about the architecture and it's about what the buildings are saying. And I feel that's a really important point, because neighborhoods are more than an accumulation or what would you say?
More than the sum of their parts.
It's more than, thank you.
Yeah.
Because it's about what's the tree canopy like? What are the shrubs and the flowers and the landscaping? Because landscaping is definitely part of what people experience. So I think it's more that than if there is an interesting event history or personal history with a building, I will have that. Maybe it was the mayor's house. On a few tours I got the mayor's house.
I remember that.
Yes.
So that's why I asked, because I didn't know if that was just part of the repertoire, or
Mostly.
if you notice, so if you go to an area and you notice like these are actually historic homes, or this looks like a home that I might want to look at. Okay.
So, and I often say I'm training people to be architectural historians, but actually short of that, it's like whenever you're traveling or in your own city, you can go out and do this and just entertain yourself by saying, okay, now I know I can tell the difference between a Spanish colonial revival and a Tudor revival. And oh, isn't that fun?
Yeah.
You know, and so you're out with your brother-in-law or whoever is visiting.
Oh, for sure.
And you can just do that. So to me, it really is about the image and the impression and the context of the neighborhood.
Yeah. Well, certainly, speaking about the learning aspect of the architectural terms, I mean, that's what really got me excited the first time I did a talk or something. And I remember at my old brokerage that we went through a number of our listings that we'd had as a company, in the last 12 months, and you kind of highlighted a few of them to talk about. This is a great example of a Dutch colonial, or American bungalow, or whatever. And sometimes, of course, it's tricky because I know you speak of the area as having a lot of whimsy, and you see the sort of like, well, it's two different styles, or it's a combination, and the true blue, the architects are like, oh, that's an abomination, and sometimes it is, but a lot of these are relatively simple designs overall, where I think they probably made those decisions based on making a home either affordable or attractive without making the layout strange, and having been selling Portland real estate now for over 20 years, and my sweet spot, if you will, my specialty is old houses, and over time I can pull up and I can tell you within probably 3 years when it was built.
Yeah, good for you.
Well, it's just
It's
time
fun.
in the saddle. There's certain style windows where if they're long and skinny, then it was probably pre-1910. And if they're like a divided light window where they just have the horizontal divider, then I'm like, that home was built in 1940, 41, 42. That's it. Like, that's when they had those. And you just get to know things, and then people are like, how did you know that? And well, I mean, the city was built, and just like I imagine all cities, it was platted and at different phases. There were, and then styles changed, and building codes changed, and materials changed.
All of that.
Yeah. So when you work in that space a lot, then and then when I first moved here, I discovered Rejuvenation, which was like my happy place. I learned so much about period lighting and the periods that are not separated by wars necessarily, but really have to do with different periods of style influences, like from England and Europe. And lighting is a huge part actually of getting a home ready for market. Now you don't have to go to Rejuvenation. A lot of the different era styles that have become popular in restorative remodeling are available on Wayfair, and even Home Depot has come a long way in the last 10 years with what they offer. And it's amazing to me how many people don't change the lighting in their home, and then when I come in to get it ready for market, I'm drawn right away to that dining room fixture, which is awful, or just at odds with the era of the home, or what buyers are looking for, millennials, whatever your demographic is probably going to be for that house. That's kind of one of my secret weapons, is changing lighting for not that much money.
Sure.
So you talked a little bit about when, but I think before we started the podcast, your favorite neighborhoods.
Sure.
So what would you say are your favorites here?
Okay, so a general comment. I think I was captivated and drawn to Portland because of the early 20th century neighborhoods, post-dating the Lewis and Clark Exposition 1905 up until the Depression. So, and that would define much of what we call inner southeast, inner northeast, inner northwest, parts of southwest Portland as well. Primarily, I would say the streetcar neighborhoods on the east side of the Willamette River were and are captivating to me. So, which are my favorites? I mean, you say Laurelhurst, you'd say Eastmoreland, Buckman, which actually is not really, it's a pre-streetcar neighborhood, has some fabulous variety there.
Yes, it does.
And so, I mean, we're looking at Sunnyside, or looking at what's Richmond in that area, up to St. John's, over to University Park. I mean, you go on and on and on. And so my flippant answer when someone asks me, what's your favorite neighborhood? I say the one I'm about to do a walking tour in, or the one that we just walked through.
Yeah.
So it seems a little bit of an overstatement, but I don't think it is. Every neighborhood obviously it has history. It has its origin story. Why was it developed there? On the east side, as I say, it was primarily because of the development of the electric streetcar. So it provided, I think another thing about the streetcar neighborhoods is that there is always kind of a commercial center. Think of Alberta Street, think of Hawthorne Street, think of Morrison Street, Belmont. So it's kind of like a node. That's a defining element, and oftentimes you find a school nearby, and the church is nearby, and a park nearby. So all these elements are defining that particular neighborhood.
Absolutely.
It could be overlooked. I mean, any of the neighborhoods, honestly, will have elements that are kind of the standout. The easiest one, I think, for people to quickly understand, the Hollywood neighborhood. What's the defining building in the Hollywood neighborhood?
The theater.
It's the Hollywood Theater.
Yeah.
So, and then we have businesses around there, we have churches, and we have parks, and we have schools.
Right.
So that's, east, southeast, northeast, just charming.
Yeah, that's where the first almost 12 years I lived here. I was in northeast and Laurelhurst, and then southeast in the Richmond neighborhood.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, the Waverly Heights.
Oh, Waverly Heights.
Yeah, which is that sort of subsection, south of Division, north of Powell. In the 20s and 30s, there's a bit of a hill there.
That is what's so fascinating, and maybe this is true in other cities, because Portland is really the first and only big city that I've lived in. But this idea of the definitions of neighborhood, I mean, the easy ones, I think, for many people, like St. John's. St. John's is aggressively self-identifying as St. John's.
Yes.
We're not just
with the
North
bridge
Portland,
and
we're St. John's.
its own island.
But each neighborhood, the neighborhood associations. I lived in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Right, and people say Brooklyn. I say yes. Portland has a Brooklyn, and Brooklyn has its own vibe. Its own
it sure does.
Building.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the fascinating things about Portland. And I do know from living in the Midwest that is in many cities, Milwaukee and even the Twin Cities, much of that has been lost. Whereas out in the West Coast, I think, particularly in Portland and Seattle, there's really that sense of there's kind of a spatial. Yes, there's a spatial sense of I'm in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, and now I'm going into a different neighborhood.
Right.
Or I'm in Lansing Mission, now I'm going to Colonial Heights.
And I think in its own way, the urban growth boundary, Portland was a little ahead of its time back in the early 70s. Right. And when they imposed that, I think it really sort of strengthened that desire to work within the neighborhood and make that neighborhood retain its identity, get more density, have its own destination coffee shops and public transportation. They were really just expanding the light rail when I moved here in 2000. They were in the midst of putting that in and getting people from both the west side and the east side and downtown to the airport. Yeah. And there's another plan that they're supposed to be breaking ground on with TriMet on the west side and up Barber and out to Lake Oswego. I don't know when that's gonna actually happen, but I mean, the pandemic was, this sort of everything stood still for a couple of years.
Sure.
But I think that move of like embracing public transportation and infill construction, I think that's a really wise way to keep the city from having like a sprawl problem, which you see in other areas. So I was gonna ask you, I've noticed as I followed you on Instagram that you oftentimes are producing reels into other cities, and I'm wondering, is that do you pick these destinations to do more tours and or is it because you happen to be in, I don't know, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and you think, well, I should do a couple of reels here. So is that intentional? Is that, just because you're traveling and you think, well, I'm in a new city, I should do some video reels?
Yeah, it's opportunistic. When I travel, clearly architecture, city history, the arts, all that is very important to me. But I will go looking for architecture. I'll go looking for the historic residential neighborhoods. I'll try to find the downtown commercial district. And then I haven't posted much actually very recently, but I will find a building that I want to, have a little mini, I guess it's like a mini podcast, if you will.
Yeah.
Maybe a minute or maybe 90 seconds. So those are opportunistic, and it's not that I'm planning to do an extensive walking tour there at some point, but it's just, again, the delight and curiosity that I have about architecture and about buildings and what I would see in, say, Corvallis, or I'm in Walla Walla, or I'm in Seattle, and typically it's Pacific Northwest, but not obviously when I'm in the Chicago area. I will post Instagrams from the Chicago.
I wanted to talk a little bit when you came in, I gave you a little tour, and one of the things that really drew me, one of the reasons I was drawn into this space for my office was its history, and it can be very challenging to find the provenance of a house because they don't necessarily keep the records for who the architect was. And that's really tragic.
I find that often the case is that you can track the ownership history through city directories.
Yes.
You can track building permit history through Portland Maps.
Yeah.
There are ways that people can pretty much directly do that. And if you want to dig deeper, you can look at census records and all that.
Right.
But oftentimes, what I think is one of the most important questions, as you alluded to, is who is the architect? And that often does get lost unless the building is listed on the National Register and someone has done the deep spade work, the deep digging to find out.
Right.
So I think in some ways the architects are the unsung heroes of architectural history in many cities, not just in Portland.
Do you have any tricks to find, when you're researching, the lineage or parentage of houses?
I think in any community, there's always a particular set of resources. It could be the newspaper files. It could be the census records that actually bring you into the nuts and bolts, the granular, what people call the granular details of a particular house. And so I guess I would say I'm more of a generalist. I will look at, in Portland, you can go to the City of Portland website and you can see a map of buildings that have been listed and identified as historic structures. They may not be on the National Register, but if nothing else, you get a date of construction, you get an architect or builder, if known, and the first owner.
Right.
And so that's kind of, that's a rather shallow, that's a little bit of information, but sometimes that then would take you to another area. So I guess when I'm doing a new neighborhood, I'll tell you where I go. This is not a trade secret. I go to the neighborhood association.
Oh, yeah.
Because oftentimes they have a motherload. In fact, I'm doing this open house in Eastmoreland. I thought, I'm going to go to the Eastmoreland Neighborhood Association. And there on the website was the significant part of the National Register nomination, as well as archival photographs and so forth. So, and that's to go back one step earlier, when I'm doing research on a house, obviously I talk to the owner.
Oh, yeah.
And if the owner doesn't know, maybe Gladys next door, who knew the family since the 1950s.
Right.
So those are the kind of direct face-to-face things that I think are really important. And then if you have more time to do that granular digging. But a lot of times when I'm doing a walking tour, I want to give. It's kind of like I want to go with the macro. I want to go with the big picture, and there are ways to find out the micro. And the best way to find out about it would be to talk to neighbors and so forth. But I mean, there are always wonderful gems and stories to discover. But I find the discovery is in more of the kind of contextual experience for people.
And talking about Portland as it's having this rich history, and of course, we're only separated from the state of Washington by a river.
Yes.
And, for 2 years, I had my license in Washington as well. And after 2 years, I thought I'd kill myself if I was in rush hour traffic going over one of the bridges one more time. But actually, at this point, we're expanding Larkin Fir into Clark County. And you may recall that we're named for the Oregon state bird and state tree. And so our subsidiary in Vancouver is going to be named after the Washington state bird and state tree. So it will be known as hemlock and finch.
Oh, that's clever.
Oh, thanks. Well, it seems appropriate to do that. And people really like that there's, a local grounding of the company. And so, it's paying homage to, being in Washington. And have you been asked to do Vancouver tours?
So I have a tour, and downtown Vancouver has some gems. A very interesting history. There are kind of these vacant spots where there were buildings that were torn down, and there was some some infill in the banks in the 1970s and 80s that are just really totally inappropriate. But there's a lovely library, and there's some wonderful architectural fabric. So Vancouver, yes, old Vancouver and new Vancouver. The waterfront's fascinating.
It is.
We've got the industrial stories there.
Yes.
But one of my favorite state of Washington tours is Camas.
Oh, I was just going to say, what about Camas? Because that has a darling little downtown.
Super little downtown. And actually in the periphery, there's some interesting residential architecture. In fact, there's an A.E. Doyle designed building in Camas. So, and there's that typical eclectic mix that you even see it in small towns, early 20th century, 1900 up to about 1930. So Camas, yes. Washougal, I've done some waterfront walks there, but no architectural pieces. But Vancouver, definitely. And if you want to go west to Ilwaco, I've done an Ilwaco walking tour.
Wow.
Yes, and historic downtown Ilwaco. And again, you have to sort of suspend disbelief. But there are some gems on the other side of the river.
Oh, for sure. It's just, it's just time and distance. And as I said, it's just, you think, well, I'm just going over the river, but it really is very different. And I love that because it has its own identity, and nevertheless, for some people, that's much more attractive to them to be, on the north side of the Columbia for reasons of, commute or, whatever they're into. And of course, Portland is right here. So if you're a foodie, you can still, go to downtown Portland, and the wine country and all that. Or you can go north. They have great wine country up in Walla Walla. And but anyway, I was just wondering. I didn't know if you did any work there. So that'll be great. Maybe we'll have you when in our inaugural.
So are you? So your office is downtown.
It is downtown,
Right on the park. In that square there?
It's really close to the. Well, it's not walking distance. Maybe it's walking distance to the waterfront. But is there anything else that you'd want the audience to know about what you do?
Well, Here's what I would say. Whether I ever see you on a walking tour, whether I ever have an opportunity to present a program on architectural details and styles of the Pacific Northwest, I would say, I read an article called "To Name It Is to Know It," and to know it is to remember it. And so it's sort of like a little bit of a cliche, but to name a Dutch colonial and say, oh, I know it's a Dutch colonial because it has a gambrel roof instead of a gable roof. Now, for some people, that's a snoozer. For me, I think it is the heart, in many ways, of what I do is appreciation. To name it is to know it, and to know it then is to remember it and say, oh, developer's coming in, he's going to tear down that funny little, that little shack down the way. And well, the shack might be a Craftsman bungalow, and say, by the way, that's a Craftsman bungalow built in 1925, and let's not just dismiss it as a shack. That's an extreme example.
Right.
But naming it as a bungalow or as a Craftsman or as a colonial or whatever the term, that implies a certain value.
Absolutely.
And so that's my deal.
Yeah.
Okay, value.
Is value and appreciate that. Well, thank you for taking the time. Lovely to have you here, and I'm sure our paths will cross again soon, whether that be in a continuing education class or out on the street.
Sure.
Yeah, one of the tours.
Look forward to it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalise.
Yeah.
Pleasure.
Thanks everyone for
Pleasure to be part
tuning in and listening to us talk about Portland's neighborhoods and its historical architecture, which is never something I tire of learning about and chatting about.